One APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Concili Incorporated is Nevada's premier Democratic campaign firm. Fighting for progressive issues and candidates for over a decade, and proud sponsor of Battle-Born Progress. Tonight's episode of Out in Front is brought to you by our season sponsors, Concili Inc., Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt, as well as our episode sponsors, Save Lives Nevada and Washoe Education Association.
All right, welcome back everyone to Out in Front with Annette. My name is Annette Magnus and I'm the Executive Director of Battleborn Progress. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Out in Front. We have some very special guests tonight that we're being joined by, and I'm actually not even in Nevada tonight. I am out in Virginia. So we are joined by Donna West, and we are also joined by Kimi. We're gonna have another special guest that will be joining us later in the show that we will introduce in just a little bit. But first I wanna bring in Donna and Kimi. Obviously Donna is our Southern Nevada activist. She does so much with our community and helped me with the food pantry in Southern Nevada, which by the way, Donna, we won the best, or we call it the Buck of the Year, the biggest bang for your buck award at our national conference for our food pantry. So thanks for being here, Donna. And then I want to introduce Kimi Cole, all around badass of the North. Kimi does all kinds of work in Northern Nevada to make our state a better place. So Kimi, thank you. Welcome to the show. So good to have you both here. All right, y'all want to come in and tell us a little bit about yourself? Donna, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Donna West, I've been active since high school, marched against the Vietnam War and for the ERA, was a bra burner, and have worked on political campaigns since my early days. But voting rights has always been near and dear to my heart, and especially this last cycle, as Annette knows, getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go out to the Clark County Election Department to watch ballot opening, counting, and signature verification, particularly because there were so many unreasonable challenges to the process. So was very excited and grateful to have Battleborn submit my name to Fair Fight Action to get to go to Washington, D.C. last week to talk about voting in Nevada and voting rights overall.
Absolutely. And Kimi, tell us a little bit about yourself other than the introduction I gave.
So my name is Kimi Cole. I'm currently chair of the Rural Nevada Democratic Caucus, but my story goes back a ways till about 12 years ago when I knew absolutely less than nothing about politics. And I went through a major life change, and all of a sudden I discovered I was being treated differently than I'd been treated before, and I didn't like it. It really got me to thinking, how must anybody feel, if they're treated differently, or they can't just go on about their business and be treated well or with respect. And I thought, well, there's probably too many people in that category, and maybe I can do something about it. So that was my original motivation. Minority communities have been a passion of mine ever since I got active. And one of the other things, I'm absolutely a passionate advocate for our rural counties. So many people are out in the distance, and there are times where they don't feel like their voices are heard. They don't get to connect with enough of our legislators. So we've done a lot of work to bring our legislators in together with the rural counties and do our best to inspire people out in the rural areas that their voices do matter, and that we're there to support them moving forward. This was a great opportunity that fell in line with those motivations that I just talked about.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about voting rights in the state of Nevada, and this is one of the places where Nevada actually is excelling. We are doing incredible things in the state of Nevada to really move our voting system forward, make sure it's safe and secure, do some incredible stuff. But around the country, we are not seeing the same trend. This is one of the places where I'm very proud of Nevada, and we are kind of bucking some of those trends and really kind of charting a course for the way states should be doing good voting systems. And so I think it's really important to have both of you there advocating for Southern Nevada, Northern Nevada, the rural communities, to talk about these things, because we're doing it the right way in Nevada, and other states should be emulating that. So I want to get to our first question about kind of the big picture of voting, not just, we've talked so much on this show about voting in Nevada, but now we want to talk big picture about what's going on in this country, especially after the Trump debacle this past year. So Donna, I'm going to start with you for the first question. Voting is so critical to people making their voices heard. Why are you so passionate about making sure that everyone has access to voting in the US and in Nevada?
Well, it started with my dad, who was a Pearl Harbor survivor, enlisted at 17. Growing up, I heard those stories and I asked him, why would you choose to go into that war before you were drafted? And he said, our democracy was at stake, our nation, everything we believe in. And he taught me that voting was a sacred right and that the least you could do as a citizen is register and vote in every election. In our house, if you wanted to talk politics or governmental policy, you had to vote. Otherwise, you would get shut down in family conversations. So it was important to me. I registered on my 18th birthday. I was excited about that. I voted every election. Then working at the DMV, when Motor Voter came into existence, Catherine Cortez Masto was Governor Miller's chief of staff, and I got to work on that project with our 17 counties to start getting everybody registered to vote. And got really interested in it then, working with the election departments and county clerks, talking to customers who waited a long time in DMV to try and convince them to get registered, to use their voice. Would tell them, if you want to make DMV or anything better, you need to go to the polls and you need to elect people that are going to help make those changes happen. And so voting's just always been very fundamental to me. And as my father said, it's a sacred right. And it's the one I believe right now we have to fight the hardest for.
I couldn't agree more, Donna. So, Kimi, I want to bring you in next. The Senate adjourned after a marathon voting session on the budget. And on early Wednesday morning, they did not address the For the People Act. What are your thoughts on this, given your recent advocacy and your work in DC?
Well, disappointed is the polite version of how I felt. But I know there was so much activity and focus on the budget. One of the other things that I've learned since I've been actively involved is persistence really must be part of our game plan for success, especially when we have such important issues, and especially when they become so heavily politicized. Too often we see situations like this where the motivation by one party or another is to take or maintain political power, and it's not in the best interest of the majority of the population. So the way I look at it, maybe we didn't get it this time. The timing didn't allow us to move the legislation as we would have hoped. But we need to keep bringing this back to the table. We need to keep fighting for it. There is so much at stake. And after the stories that we heard from some of the people that were in our delegation, the only thing I can say that we are still having these types of conversations about people that are singled out and discriminated against because of the color of their skin or their background or where they live. It's ridiculous that we're still having these conversations in the 21st century. So let's just say this was one round. It didn't go completely our way. We need to bring this back and back and back until it's a done deal.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Kimi. And this is the whole game plan here, by the right, is to continue chipping away at voting rights, to make it harder to intimidate people, to strip away rights that are, in the Constitution. They are given to us as citizens of the United States, that we have the right to vote, and it is a right. It's not something that's a privilege. And so this notion that we should be making it harder by enacting voter ID laws or enacting, the laws that they just put in place in Georgia, where people can't even hand out food or water in line when people are standing there for hours to exercise their right to vote. It's really appalling to me. And I think it shows what the agenda on the other side actually is. So Kimi, I want to follow up on that then. What was your experience like when you and Donna were in DC last week? And did you see a lot of support for the People Act? And what did you hear around opposition to that? And what possibly could they be saying about this?
Well, I've got to admit, this is the quickest political trip I've ever made. One of the conditions before we even started is if we can squeeze this into a schedule with the shoehorn, we can possibly make it work. So the entire trip was a very early Monday morning flight. We landed in Washington, D.C. We made our way to the hotel. We briefed, got a few hours sleep, testified all next day, did some photo ops, slept a couple more hours, got a plane, came home. So that was my experience going back to D.C. However, the Senate staffs that we spoke to in my delegation were Senator Klobuchar, Senator Rosen, Senator Kelly, and Senator Sinema, and they had their top staffs listening to us, and they listened very intently to all the stories we brought from around the country. So the fact that they were so gracious to listen to the stories that we had, and you can tell when you're on the phone with somebody when they're paying attention, and there was nods of acknowledgement. And when we got to the end of the sessions and asked, do you have any questions? Was there anything that we didn't cover? Please feel free to bring it up. And other than just a couple clarification questions, I did not get any impression that we had anything other than supporters with the people that we were willing to talk to. So we were in a good group, and I obviously can't speak for all the other delegations, but that was my experience.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm glad that at least our delegation and the folks that you spoke to are feeling positive about this and will hopefully support this critical piece of legislation. So, Donna, I want to bring it back to you. It's important that we're doing this week and talking about voting rights nationally, because the Voting Rights Act anniversary was last week. It was last Friday. Do you think we have come far enough concerning voting rights? And if not, what more do you think needs to happen? And what more do we need to be what more do we need to be advocating for?
As a state, we've come all the way. And I'm very proud of that. As a nation, we are going backwards. We need to make sure that automatic voter registration is in federal legislation, same-day voter registration, mail-in ballots for every registered voter, and convenient drop boxes are available everywhere for everyone. And I think those things may be in the Manchin compromise. I'm concerned that we're going to lose the dark money in politics, and that we may lose some of the gerrymandering language, which concerns me a lot, seeing the census data that came out today. But we've got to keep fighting. I was on a call earlier today with Congresswoman Dina Titus, and she said that House is going back into session the third week of August, and they will raise the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and pass it at that time and send it over to the Senate. So we will be in that same log jam. My understanding is that Senator Klobuchar and Senator Merkley with the Rules Committee in the Senate will be bringing the hearings on For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in September. And so we need to start sharpening pencils and being prepared. I know for one, I'm prepared to go back to Washington again if it'll help, to talk about what Nevada has done, how it has been successful, how it has been secure. We have to keep pushing back against the big lie. Far too many people are buying that. And those of us who have been in the room with the ballots, watching the counting, need to talk about that process. We need to talk about signature verification. We need to talk about ballot curing, and we need to bring those facts forward so that they don't get lost in this deluge of lies and misinformation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Donna. Making sure we're talking about the systems we have in place. You and I did observe those systems in Clark County, and we got up at 3 a.m. some mornings to go observe as the ballots were being counted. There were folks in there from both sides of the aisle, and people like me who were nonpartisan, who were right down the middle, who were in there watching as well. And so this notion that somehow there were some shenanigans or something bad happening, it's simply not true. It's a complete lie. And we know that, we saw it, we were in there, we audited all the different processes. Our staff, my staff was in the entire process. And so I think the more we talk about that experience and show that real people were in the room from all different sides of the political spectrum, and this nonsense that they're putting out there is just because they couldn't win and they knew they couldn't win. And that's the bottom line. So Kimi, I want to come back to you, staying on the topic of the Voting Rights Act. Sorry, I lost my place, of course, on the screen as I did that. So in light of the recent anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, what positive changes are you most proud of concerning voting rights in Nevada? And you know, in the United States, but specifically Nevada, we've done so many important things over the past several sessions to improve our voting rights system. I think one of the things I'm most happy about is reenfranchising so many people who are formerly incarcerated. I think that's one of the proudest moments of my career, was being able to reenfranchise so many voters who needed to be reenfranchised. But what are some things that you're really happy about in Nevada that you'd like to see emulated elsewhere?
I would say this is a bit of a mixed question for me. Obviously, some of the things we've accomplished in Nevada, we rightfully can be very, very proud of. But also, one of the things that I continue to put out there is we can't take any of it for granted. Because I know from various legislative sessions, some of the proposed legislation that I've lobbied for, opposed, we have been faced with challenges to everything that we have right now, and there's no reason that we can just sit completely secure and say these challenges are not going to come back. So yes, we can be very proud of where we are in Nevada, but we have to realize there's many places in the country that don't have the access. If somebody is of a different color, if they live a long ways away from the polls, if they're Native American, any of the minority communities, there are challenges to voting, and they keep coming back. So I would like to look at Nevada as a model of how it can be done, could be done, hopefully to inform the rest of the country, and then hope it catches on with a lot of people, and we can we can carry that message, whether it's in DC or however we communicate. But I just think it is just so incredibly important that the right of people in society to participate in the vote, feel like they are part of society, that their vote matters, that their voices are being heard. That is just something that is so incredibly important to me. I say, we just can't take any of the good stuff for granted. We can pat ourselves on the back very briefly, but the other side of it is we need to get up tomorrow and do it all again.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Kimi, is not taking this stuff for granted. I think, under the Trump administration, we really saw the risk of taking things for granted. Under the Obama administration, so many things moved forward, but the moment that Donald Trump took over, even things that are not voting rights related, like public lands and civil rights and criminal justice reform and children in cages, you name it, it's like suddenly we just went completely backwards, and all of the work we had done for 8 years just was overturned very quickly. And so I think, it's really important to remember, just because we have nice things in Nevada doesn't mean if, God forbid, somebody like an Adam Laxalt gets elected, that those things can't change and those things can't go backwards. And so I think that's a really important reminder for all of us, that we have to not only pass good laws, but uphold them too and protect them long term. So Donna, I want to come back to you. What do you think the most important aspect of protecting voting rights is?
Well, we need to get consistent access for everyone. Some of the stories we heard were horrendous. A Black female voter in Ohio that was part of our lobbying group saw her name on the poll book with her signature, and they told her she wasn't registered to vote. She objected. She talked about calling the voter protection hotline, and they let her vote. My concern continues to be the lack of voter information. How do voters who aren't in this inner circle of ours that understand voting rights and voter protection know what to do if they run into somebody? Again, I think Nevada does a great job. Battleborn Progress, Silver State Voices, the political parties have poll watchers, have people there, have boiler rooms. We work hard at voter protection, but I got a distinct feeling that that is more remote in some places. And I think of our rural counties, and I think of rural areas in every state where voters don't understand their rights. I don't even think Nevadans understand that we have voting rights now in our state constitution, thanks to legislation that was brought forward and was on the ballot twice, that we voted in a Voters' Bill of Rights in Nevada and put it in our constitution. And that may be a way for states to go. But again, I think this needs to come from the federal government, where we all have these guaranteed rights and that voters know what to expect and have a consistent process when they go to the polls.
Absolutely. So Kimmy, I want to come back to you. You know, we're seeing that the GOP, as per usual, continues to obstruct this process of bringing voting rights legislation forward or moving it forward. Specifically, before we try to go to break, we know that you know, Senator Schumer did attempt to try and bring it to a vote, as he did in June. But once again, the GOP blocked it, as they did in June. And so, you know, the GOP has consistently been, frankly, opposed to any type of voting rights legislation, voting rights, period, I think. You know, what do you think happens now? The Senate goes on vacation without taking it up. Does that worry you? Are you worried about the trajectory of this legislation? And, you know, kind of what was the feeling on the ground in DC around that fact that the GOP continues to obstruct?
Well, I would say my concerns are ongoing, just for the reasons that you mentioned. Uh, you know, to think that we could just pass some legislation and put everything, you know, really nicely back in order. We realize we're going to have to fight tooth and nail for every inch of every gain that we make. And you know, one of the things that I can always hope is that we are appealing to the people who it affects. You know, through the methods of outreach and education, so that people know what they have their hands on, how important it is. But you know, I think of this For the People Act and things that I have been speaking with for years. This would be like my amazing wish list. You know, like changing campaign laws to reduce the influence of money in politics. That's big. Banning partisan gerrymandering, creating new ethics rules for federal office holders, and make the presidential tax returns be disclosed. There are so many aspects of this that I like. And, you know, I'm not naive to think, okay, we're going to get it all, but I think we got to put the whole package in there. Like Donna said, maybe some pieces will be carved out. That's going to happen with people with different points of view in all this. But we need to keep, I think personally, we need to keep pushing for it all. We need to keep going after perfect. We need to get as close as we can, and we need to come back and again and again and again until we get as darn close to perfect as we possibly can.
Yeah, Kimmy, I think that's a really important point on this legislation. You know, oftentimes I think we have to compromise on our values, or we have to compromise on legislation to get it over the finish line. You know, I talk about that a lot when I'm up at legislative session, because if you want to get something done, sometimes you do have to compromise. It's not always great. I'm often less than pleased about doing it because we fight really hard for these issues. But you know, on this one, I just don't think there's compromise. I had the opportunity and the privilege to meet with one of our dear friends, Emmy Ruiz, who's now at the White House this week. And, you know, one of my colleagues in the Progress Now network brought up to her that, we have a unique opportunity with the Biden administration and controlling the Senate and the House that we can't squander, especially on something as important as voting rights. And so I guess, as somebody who has been involved in progressive politics for a very long time, talk to me about your feelings on how this is just something I feel, at least, we can't compromise on. There's no compromising on voting rights to me. Kimi, that was for you.
Oh, okay. So one of the things, anybody that knows me, one of the most incredibly valuable aspects of life, as far as I'm concerned, is the value of the human spirit. And I'm always looking at this, when the human spirit is recognized, is acknowledged, that they feel like they have a place in life. Everything that I can think about the way I see life, how people are treated, how people get through life, how they move forward, is all based on, having these voting rights that we're talking about. They're just so incredibly precious. So, I think it's incumbent on us who have been involved and participate to share our stories every chance possible, to remind people how important this is. But not only that, to encourage them and empower them to feel like they can participate, so that we can show them the way. And I can't think of anything in my life that's been more satisfying than really sinking my teeth into something, say that's something I really want to go after, whether it's a piece of legislation or an issue vote or whatever like it, and to get through it and say, we got a good outcome, or we got an outcome that I was really pleased with. And I feel so good about being able to be part of that. And what that does is it inspires people to say, if we won before, we can win again. We can take this on, bring on the challenges, and we just need to keep charging forward like there is absolutely nothing in our way. Damn the GOP anyway. Sorry.
Don't say sorry on this show. I couldn't agree more. Okay, I'm gonna have you all just hang with me for a few minutes. Kimi and Donna will bring you back in at the end of the show, but I do want to bring in my friend and colleague Liza Conrad with Fair Fight. Lisa, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. I know you're on the East Coast with us, so thanks for hanging in there with us. Welcome to this space, and tell us about the important work that Fair Fight is doing, and what your organization is and who began it, because I think that's always really important.
Thank you so much for having me, Annette. And I'm always happy to do West Coast events if it means hanging out with Battleborn Progress and our friends in Nevada. I'm Liza Conrad. I'm the Director of Voter Protection at Fair Fight Action. We are a Georgia-based national voting rights organization that works to protect the freedom to vote for folks all across the country. Fair Fight Action, as you mentioned, was founded by Stacey Abrams, and we are really excited to be here and really enjoy working with you all in Nevada, and are just always inspired and impressed by what Nevadans are able to do in terms of voting rights, and agree with what you all were saying at the beginning around Nevada really demonstrating with Governor Sisolak and Speaker Fryerson's leadership what's possible when we have pro-voter Democrats in charge. So it's a pleasure to be here, and we appreciate your help, and Donna and Kimi for joining us last week here in Washington for our fly-in.
Yeah, so Liza, talk to us about the fly-in and the importance of that. I know y'all had folks from all over the country talking about their stories and access to voting. Some states, you have positive things like Nevada, and some states you have not so positive things happening. What was the importance of doing that fly-in right now, and what were you all trying to accomplish with these fabulous activists that you brought to DC?
Yeah. So Fair Fight Action has always really believed that at the center of everything we do are voters and their voices, right? We are trying to make elections work for all eligible voters, to make sure that people's voices are heard. And ultimately, when people go out to vote, they're not just going to do some chore, they're going to accomplish their dreams for themselves and their families and their communities. So when we talk about voter suppression, we want to make sure that it's actually voters who are talking. They're talking about their experience and about the impact that it had on them. And so that's been a central tenet for everything we've done at Fair Fight Action. And earlier this month, Senator Klobuchar came to Georgia for the Rules Committee's first hearing in nearly 2 decades to hear from Georgians about SB 202, which you were talking about, a law that our Republican legislature passed earlier this year that restricts Georgians' freedom to vote. And Senator Klobuchar really wanted to hear from regular Georgians about how this law would affect them and really the experiences they've had and the barriers they face to voting. And we found that panel and the events surrounding it very impactful. And it was very meaningful to the senators to hear from regular people about the barriers they face, because it's one thing to read a statistic in an article or hear someone be quoted. And it's quite another to hear Verana from Cobb County talk about how swollen her ankles were after she waited outside all day to vote. And anyone who's ever waited in a long line can empathize with that feeling and the exhaustion you feel in your legs. And that inspired us to think, wow, we know so many amazing voters across the country, and our partners like you all have amazing networks that we can help tap into to bring folks to Washington and have an opportunity to hear directly from voters about the barriers they faced, so that as the Senate is working through voting legislation and they're thinking and they're talking to their colleagues, they can bring these anecdotes into those conversations and that perspective. So it's really about bringing the people and their issues to the forefront of the conversation and making sure that they were centered in any work happening around voting rights.
So Liza, with what that's going on in DC right now, there's a lot of progress. There's a lot of momentum building around this piece of legislation. But like I was talking with Kimi, we, as per usual, we're constantly seeing obstruction from the GOP on this issue, on other important issues as well. How do we break through that? And what is it going to take for us to be able to get this critical piece of legislation across the finish line? And how can folks maybe who didn't get to go to DC but want to be helpful and advocate on this really important issue, how can they be advocates, even in a state like Nevada, where we know that our delegation is pretty solid on this issue?
It's a great question, and I am really very excited to talk about it. So, we saw a few things this week with the For the People, with Senator Schumer bringing the For the People up again. One, it really reinforced that Leader Schumer is incredibly committed to voting rights. I think it was 3:48 in the morning on Wednesday that he tried to bring For the People up for debate. And he's demonstrated time and time again that he understands the importance of this issue and is going to keep fighting for it. The second thing we saw is that Democrats are aligned. They all came together twice to vote to open debate, and that unity really demonstrates where the caucus is and is giving us a ton of excitement and hope as we move forward. And then the third is, as you said, the GOP is going to continue to be an obstacle and in fact deny the will of their constituents. For the People Act has bipartisan support. Voters of both parties support this legislation, and it's the senators who are blocking it. And this was not a surprise. And so earlier this summer, Fair Fight Action launched Hot Call Summer, which is a campaign to get voters all across the country to call their senators, because we are thinking about this as a 50-state problem, 100-senator campaign. And we're asking everyone every single day this summer to call their senator and tell them how important passing voting rights legislation is. We've directed over 55,000 calls to Senate offices thus far, and we're going to continue on. We had a really interesting event last night with Stacy and Chairwoman Beatty about pre-clearance. And so we're going to continue this fight and continue talking about both the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And we're seeing a ton, as you mentioned, of really exciting momentum there too. On Monday, the House Committee on the Judiciary is holding a hearing about reinstating pre-clearance and bringing back the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And as you said, Speaker Pelosi has indicated that the House may come to a vote on it when they come back from recess the week of the 23rd. And so we see this as incredible momentum and a real opportunity for people everywhere to make sure that your senator and your representative is prioritizing voting rights and that they are going to do everything they can to advance these two critical pieces of legislation as we go through this summer. And so if you want to get involved in Hot Call Summer, you can follow Fair Fight Action. Just check out our social media on Twitter at Fair Fight or go to fairfight.com to get involved.
Awesome. And we'll put that stuff in the chat as well, so that if folks on the ground here in Nevada, I know we're getting a lot of questions in the chat. So if folks do have questions for you or want to get involved and make their voices heard, we'll get that information out to all of the folks watching tonight. Before we get to questions, I do want to make sure that we are spoiled in Nevada. We've had a great amount of leadership in our state. And, you know, people like Speaker Frierson, like you said, are just absolute champions on voting rights. And, you know, I think we get a little bit complacent sometimes when that happens. We sometimes forget that while we're moving forward, some places in this country are going backwards. And there are some very dangerous things happening in real time in other states. And they are trying, to be clear to the folks at home, they are trying to shop those things around in Nevada. But because of our leadership that we have elected in the state of Nevada, those never see the light of day. And it's not even voter ID now, they're getting even more crafty than that. So Liza, talk to us about some of the very dangerous things we're seeing around the country and how people at home can push back on those dangerous things that are cropping up all over the United States.
Yeah, it is a moment of crisis for our democracy. We think of the issues that the right is advancing in a few categories. One is just straight up limiting access. So looking at creative ways to just make it harder and more burdensome to cast your ballot. So in Georgia, that's imposing a photo ID requirement on voting by mail, in requiring that you put your driver's license number, and other tactics. It looks like limiting access to provisional ballots before 5 p.m. on election day, restricting early vote hours, restricting curbside voting in Texas. There are a number of different ways that they're going after voter access. The second piece is criminalization. And so this looks like straight up intimidation through increasing or establishing criminal penalties that a voter or an election official could face if they run afoul or make an honest mistake. And then the third category is election subversion and power grabs. And so this is rewriting the rules and consolidating power over elections in gerrymandered state legislatures. And this is a very real threat. In Georgia, this is one of the big provisions of SB 202, and the legislature wasted absolutely no time to move on it and began the process of calling for a takeover of Fulton County, which is where Atlanta is. It is a very large county with a very large number of voters of color and Democratic voters. And so this process is very transparent, but it is a very real threat. And so what we have been doing with our allies is working to fight back at a state level and to call out the bad actors and their motivations for what they are, and inviting people to participate in the advocacy that you talked about at the state level, right, when folks are in session. But it also now looks like federal advocacy, because nothing is a panacea, but we need the For the People Act and we need the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to mitigate the impact of the bills that have already been passed. By establishing stronger minimum standards through the For the People Act, it just sort of cuts out the legs from how low they can go in terms of changing the rules. And by reinstating pre-clearance in many states, it would provide a check to make sure that when a legislature goes to pass some bill that would disproportionately impact voters of color, that someone has to make sure that's not going to happen. And so it's through this opportunity that we can really mitigate what's happening at the state level, and it's desperately needed.
Yeah, and Liza, just because I know some folks at home heard that term pre-clearance, and you hear it a lot when we're talking about voting rights overall. Talk about what pre-clearance is, because I want to make sure folks understand that and where it came from, because there's a bigger picture here of the Supreme Court and the courts
Mhm.
mattering in this whole, issue. So talk about kind of what that is and where that came from.
Yeah, so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 required certain jurisdictions that had a history of discriminating against Black voters of sending any change to their election laws, practice, or procedures to DOJ or a federal court in Washington, D.C. to review before it was enacted or implemented to ensure that it wouldn't have a discriminatory or disparate impact. And so that was, VRA was reauthorized with bipartisan support for many years until 2013, when in Shelby v. Holder, the Supreme Court struck down the formula that determined which states had to be under preclearance. And so what that meant is states that previously had to submit their changes to DOJ were free to just legislate and enact. And we saw with that a rush of anti-voter legislation that was enacted and then implemented in states. And so what the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would do is it would create an updated formula to establish which jurisdictions, states, or localities within them should be covered. And this is incredibly important because preclearance was one of the best tools we had to stop voter suppression. And today is also the day that the census data was released. This is also incredibly important for redistricting. And so this conversation couldn't be more timely, and these bills couldn't be more timely as states go to draw their maps. And we need to make sure that they are not drawing gerrymandered discriminatory maps.
Oh, you read my mind. We put out a press release today about that redistricting data. So I do want to ask you about that. I'm sorry, I'm kind of going off script here, but the redistricting conversation is so critical in this state, and it's critical all over the United States. Talk to me about why people should be involved in that process. I think people think redistricting is just, redrawing lines for congressional districts or legislatures. And that is very much that process. And we will be going through that process here in Nevada, and we will be tracking all of that information and that data as Battle Board Progress with our partners and specifically our C3 partners. But Liza, it's so much more than that. It's really looking at communities as a whole and seeing where a grocery store might need to go or a library. And this all ties back to voting rights and the importance of voting rights and the importance of drawing fair lines and all of those things. So how does this all kind of connect? What is the bigger picture here?
Well, I think you got it exactly right. Ultimately, at the end of the day, redistricting is going to determine who together can bring their voices together to elect representatives who will pass laws governing the ways that their world is shaped. All of the opportunities they have, it's super important at a local level, at a state level, at a national level. And so redistricting determines the construction of those communities, and whether you have an area with a ton of Latino voters, if you carve them up into a bunch of small districts so they can't have their collective voices come together, or whether you create districts where people have a fair chance to elect someone who represents them and their interests. And so ultimately, voting is the method through which we pursue all of our dreams and all of our agendas. And if you don't have a district in which your voice can be equally heard, then you don't have a fair shot at any of your priorities. And so it's really important that as legislatures go through this process, that they are doing so fairly and they're not creating districts where they get to pick their voters instead of their voters picking them.
Absolutely. And we will be heavily involved in that process, like I said. So for viewers who are watching who want to learn more, we're actually going to be having a redistricting special coming up. So you can learn more about the process and how you can be empowered to be in the process and be part of the process and influence your legislators on that critical process that's going to be taking place in Nevada this fall. Normally it would happen in the spring just for those watching at home, but because the Trump administration screwed up the data so bad and thanks to COVID, we're a little behind on the process. And that's the same thing that lots of states all across the country are experiencing since the data just came out today. All right, Liza, last question for you, and then I want to move to some audience questions for the three of you. like I told, or like I was talking with Donna and Kimi earlier, you know, the Voting Rights Act anniversary was last week. And we have come so far, but we still have a long way to go in this country, not just, you know, across the country, but even here in Nevada, there's still improvements that we can be making. So what do you think and believe are the main priorities concerning voting rights moving forward, and what should we all be advocating for to have better voting laws in this country?
I think it's a super important question because that's the topic of the hour as our senators work on For the People and the House works on the VRA. They want to know what matters. And we've been emphasizing a few things, thinking about sort of the attacks that I was framing. One is that we need to protect and expand access to vote by mail. Kimi and Donna talked about some of their colleagues from other states who joined us in Washington, who talked about the onerous and burdensome process they had to go through to vote by mail. Mississippi, it's notarizing an application, if you are lucky enough to qualify, notarizing an application and a ballot. So we need to ensure everyone, all eligible voters vote by mail. We need to address long lines. We talked earlier about a voter who had to wait, Miranda, all day, hours and hours until her ankles are swollen. This is unacceptable. And so we need this legislation to address long lines through and prevent closure of polling locations. This is something Nevada experienced last year in the primary, right? What happened when you really reduce the number of polling locations and the impact of the people who had to wait in those lines. And then we also need to address the election subversion pieces. We need to protect voters from intimidation. We need to protect election workers from intimidation. And we need to ensure the integrity of the process. We also need, going back to pre-clearance, to prevent partisan gerrymandering and to reinstate pre-clearance. So those are the 5 big buckets that we've been thinking about and focusing on.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. And I'll just add, here in Nevada, you know, we did have a very successful legislative session, you know, several sessions in a row. We still have a lot of work ahead of us here in Nevada. Don't think the work is over. There are still better voting laws that we will be working on in the 2023 session. But right now, we have to implement all the voting laws we just passed. And we have to make sure that those get implemented correctly over the next few years as those start to go into effect. So, you know, we made those voting laws that made our system a hybrid system with vote by mail, same day voter registration. All of those things are amazing things. We've made those permanent now. And so now we're going to actually have to put those into action and implement those. We also expanded automatic voter registration. We had passed that in the 2017 legislative session, 2019 legislative session. We've done so many. It's a good problem. I forget which sessions.
It's hard to count when you keep winning.
I'm like, oh, we've done so many things. Anyways, but that was 2019. And so that was a really positive thing. But you know, we've now expanded automatic voter registration to Medicaid offices, which will get even more people enrolled and on the books. But that has to be implemented properly over the next few years. So there's still a lot of work ahead of us, and Nevada has a long way to go in making sure that our voting rights systems are correct and good. All right, Liza, Kimi, and Donna, I'm going to come to you for these questions from our audience. Audience, if you have questions, we do have a few more minutes for questions since we got started a few minutes late. So Liza, I'm going to start with you. You know, it seems we fight on their political ground, trying to prove a negative. And this is from Sharon, I should have said that, I apologize. She says that voter fraud doesn't exist, which we know it doesn't. Why don't we change the narrative to securing the vote in a fair fight so voters can be sure that they choose the candidate, not some amorphous boogeyman?
Yes, I think Sharon has been to the same messaging briefings. You know, there's 2 things I think that are really important about that comment and the framing. The first is we live in a time where we are at war with disinformation. There is a tremendous effort to confuse and dissuade and dismay our voters. It's, you know, our folks who are getting targeted by disinformation. It's not just the other side trying to trick their own folks. So recognizing that we are targets is really important. And what I was going to say, though, is we don't want to play into that narrative. So we want to always lead with the truth, and lead with an empowering message. So I talked a lot about our freedom to vote, and that is the framing that we are using to talk about the power and the opportunity that we have and the importance of ensuring that right for our voters and everyone.
Absolutely. Donna, Kimi, do you have anything you want to add to that one? Okay, we'll keep going. So our dear friend, Richard Gilroy, says, and Donna, I'm going to come to you for this one since he's our bestie. We know our senators support the For the People Act, but what action can we take to move it forward? In other words, how can we influence other state senators? And I know you did some of this when you were in Washington, D.C. with Fair Fight. So what suggestions do you have outside of the ones that Liza already gave?
I would find my friends in other states. Richard, I know you've got friends back in the DMV. Get to those people that you know in other states. The best person to talk to their senator is a constituent first. Those are their votes. But talk to them. Ask them their personal voting story. One of the reasons Fair Fight brought us all in for the fly-in is that Senator Klobuchar found out by going to Georgia and having her Rules Committee meet in Georgia and hearing from voters firsthand, lawmakers don't hear our stories. When we're talking to them, we're talking to them because we got a problem with our veterans check or housing or some other issue, but we don't sit down and talk about, hey, I went to vote and this thing happened to me. And we found that the senators that we talked to, their staff, really tuned in. I have to tell you, these visits were incredibly impactful on staff. Every staff member repeated back to us a portion of each voter's story. We knew we were heard. It went so far, Rich, that the group that was lobbying Joe Manchin, which is one I listened carefully to, they impacted his staff so much that when we went over to the Capitol, he came outside and met them. Joe Manchin. So if you ever think that talking to senators can't make a difference, it can. But if you know somebody in those states, do that. Otherwise, I would say jump on with Fair Fight and Hot Call Summer and get in there and make phone calls. If you've got family in other states, talk on their behalf if they won't make those calls. I call California for my grandsons. I have a grandson with disabilities. We heard from so many disabled voters that had such difficult time getting to the polls, having the proper equipment, having a ramp, having a voting machine equipped for them. And it's now going to be part of my mission. And I know Nevada's done some work in this area in the 2019 session to help voters with disabilities, but it's now going to be part of my story as well, is to make sure that all of our voters have access. That we just have to keep it up. We just have to keep it up.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Donna. Kimi, I want to move to you for the second part of Richard's question. He also added to that, how could we be influencing other state senators? Moreover, how can we overcome the GOP's filibuster? I think that's going to be another whole other kind of beast of this, is not just their filibuster, but their obstruction and really kind of keeping the pressure on the GOP, because we know the Democrats are in a good place. We know Senator Schumer and, Speaker Pelosi are in a good place on this. They support it. Our delegation supports it. So how do we keep the pressure on the GOP to stop being anti-voting?
Well, one thing we have to do is we need to keep speaking up. I know I was outside the Capitol back in Washington, D.C., and if anybody remembers Tim Kaine, he was the vice presidential candidate in 2016. We just happened to run into each other, and I mentioned that we had met in Philadelphia in 2016, and I asked him what the top priorities were for him right at the moment, and he distinctly mentioned they're working on ways to work with Manchin and Sinema to make sure that we have a way to work around the filibuster. I've come to understand, and I'll just put this in, maybe going off side just a little bit, But the filibuster has been dangerous to us at times. But there are certain situations where I realize I've heard from Senator Reid in the past where just getting rid of it could open us up to potential future danger. So I do know that there are legislators looking at it comprehensively, realize it has negative effects. And I know they're working diligently on working around it. I got the impression that there's ongoing conversations, and I don't think that is lost even on the senators that are kind of putting their feet down on it right at the moment. I think there is room for movement. And, you know, on our end, the best that we can do, like Donna said, if we have connections in other states, put it on our our senators here in this state to keep reminding it. And I hope a lot of people realize the way the Senate offices work. If you call a senator and say, here's my point of view, and you weigh in, well, yeah, that's definitely something. We need to keep doing that. But if we're persistent and we call again and multiple and repeated times, it lists there is this much passion for this. And if we have multiple people calling repeated times, they look at that. It stimulates how they look at how much emphasis there is on this, how much passion is it, how many people are involved, how many people does it affect. So I look at this. We need to go through the windows. We need to go through the doors. We need to come in through the chimneys, whatever we need to do to get the attention of the legislators. And it does circulate. The senators and all of our legislators, they do talk to each other. And when they have stories that I am hearing the same thing from so many of my constituents, yes, it does carry weight. So we can't give up. We just need to stay after it for sure.
Thank you for that, Kimi. Okay, Liza, I would like to come back to you for my friend Laura Levitt's question. She asks, if we don't pass the For the People Act, do you think the GOP will gerrymander their way to a House majority that they may never give up?
It's a good, and again, time, you know, we are here and we're just going to keep fighting that Congress needs to take immediate action. We know that some states have already begun drawing maps, but it's going to take weeks and in some cases months for those maps to be finalized. And September is going to be a really, really critical time for that. And so that's why it's really essential that we keep the pressure on Congress through August and into September to make sure that we have the best shot to get the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act passed as soon as they're back from recess in September. We're really emphasizing those deadlines and the fact that maps are being drawn and using that as a leverage point to continue the pressure. So I think everyone understands the risks and the obstacles that we're facing, and we need to just use that to propel us forward and make sure that we can get this done.
Absolutely. Okay, and this last question I'm actually going to take. Aurora has a question around the Brennan Center. So it's interesting, Aurora, we actually saw that a few months ago, and we've contacted Brennan Center because we do believe that they have listed Nevada incorrectly, because we have not been passing terrible laws that make voting harder. We've actually been doing amazing laws that make voting easier and more secure. And so for us, I'm going to ping them again because I didn't realize it still wasn't fixed. And I will make sure that we stay on that. But Aurora, rest assured that our voting laws are actually really good in Nevada. We just passed some really great ones to be able to improve voting for Indigenous people here, people of color, and having access to so many different things. So like I said, we re-enfranchised so many new voters. And so we're really doing great work here. So rest assured, we actually have decent voting laws, and I don't understand why they have that listed on there, but we'll be working to get that corrected. So thank you for that. All right, my fabulous panel, thank you for joining us tonight. Any parting words that you want to leave us with tonight? Liza, I'm going to start with you. Where does this campaign go from here, and what are the next steps for this big campaign to get us over the finish line and get this important legislation passed?
Well, as I said, Senator Titus said that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is coming up when they get back. So we need to stay right on top of that and support the House and keep the pressure on the Senate when it moves across. And then keep pressure on to get the hearings held, support the hearings. Senator Klobuchar and Senator Merkley are doing great work on the Rules Committee, and we just need to keep things up. And I also think, as you said, Annette, we need to keep an eye on what's happening with implementation in Nevada. Getting the laws passed is only the first step. Getting them properly implemented and making sure that we're educating voters here is just as important. If people don't know what their rights are and how to safely access the polls, then we haven't done our whole job yet.
Absolutely, Liza, I'm going to come to you.
Thank you. And I agree. I think I sound like a broken record, but I would invite everyone to join us in Hot Call Summer. It's really fun. You can get a Hot Call Summer towel, hottest beach accessory. Mine, I hope, is in the mail. And we're going to be calling our representatives next week. We'll be calling our senators, and you can go to fairfight.com to get involved and join us in Hot Call Summer, because it's only August 12th and we have a few more weeks of summer left, and we're going to be keeping the heat up and the conversations going.
Oh, dang, I need a towel. I'm going to get in on that real quick now. Kimi, talk to us about what folks in rural Nevada should be doing, especially, you're part of many rural caucuses doing work out in our rural communities. I think it's especially critical for folks in our rural communities to be getting involved with this fight, because this disproportionately impacts them.
So one of the things that we've been having a conversation about recently is, a lot of the time the Democrats are horribly outnumbered out in the rural counties, and it makes it very difficult to do outreach. And we have just started the conversation with a lot of our rural leaders and county chairs that I say, okay, if it's uncomfortable to knock on doors, if it's uncomfortable to put a table out somewhere where you feel maybe threatened or overwhelmed by the number of maybe antagonistic people of another party, we need to put on our thinking caps and think of some different approaches. And I've been really fortunate connecting with people from around the country who have overcome the same obstacles. And we're working really close. In this case, I'm working with some people in Nebraska. They came up with some great ideas. So a lot of the time, getting out the messaging, we agree how important it is. Talking to our legislators is incredibly important, but we need people to do it. So now our focus is on bringing options to people so that they have more possibilities of how they can reach out. I'm always going to be optimistic. I wake up every day optimistic, and we're just going to keep doing the work.
And Kimi, we'll end on this. If folks do live in rural communities in the state of Nevada and they want to get involved with the good organizing work that you're doing, how do they get in touch with you? Because you're doing some amazing work out in our rural areas, and that network is growing every single day.
So one of the things that I do is I amplify when we're working with great allies like Battleborn Progress, Fair Fight Action. I keep that in front of people when I'm putting out the information, and I really encourage everybody out in the rural areas to share. We've broken out of the mold a little bit. We don't just go to the established county chairs. We have people in outlying areas that have connected, by various means over the years. So we're just growing and spreading, and there's really a passion and a motivation to be involved, to speak up. And, I tell anybody, if there's a situation you don't like, let's do something about it. So I really think there's a lot of momentum going in that direction. We're going to keep building on it.
Awesome. Well, thank you all three of you for being with us tonight. It's always so great to be working with our partners at Fair Fight Action. Please, please, please get involved with Fair Fight Action. They are doing amazing work all across the country. We will continue to be partnering with them and making sure that we can get these voting rights pieces of legislation federally across the finish line and continue the important work here in the state to implement good voting rights legislation, but also to work on redistricting. So more to come on all of that. But if you want to get involved, all of the information for Fair Fight Action is in the chat tonight. So please sign up, get involved with their hot call summer action and get your free towel. I'm gonna totally do that right after this call. This is awesome. So thank you again. And thank you all for watching Out in Front again this week. We appreciate it. We will be back next week with another episode of Out in Front with Annette. And we have a lot of exciting events coming up. So make sure you're tuning into our Facebook and Twitter page, following along with what we have going on, because lots of information around the ARP and various other pieces of legislation that are moving forward federally. So thanks again for joining us and have a great evening, everyone. Stay safe and make sure you're wearing a mask.